Well, I have been looking forward to this series that we're going to start today on Daniel. If you remember, we did a series not too long ago on Noah. I really like going to the Old Testament and taking those stories that we have for so long thought were children's stories and reading them again as adults because they have really important things to say to us. And so this book of Daniel, there's 3 stories in here that we're going to look at that have too often been considered to be children's stories. But we're going to read them as adults and see what they have to say to us. The first story we're going to look at this morning is a story about what it means to have faith. I mean real faith, a mountain-moving kind of faith. Now, I preached on faith once, and I made a real mistake. I wanted to try to get the congregation involved and make it an interactive kind of sermon. And so I said, I'm going to say a word, and when I say the word, you just shout out the first thing that comes to mind. And so I said the word faith. And when I did, an elderly gentleman who was sitting over on this side of the church, as soon as I said faith, he said, hell. So this morning I'm going to ask the question rhetorically. What does it mean to have faith? And we're going to look at a story of 3 young men who I think displayed great faith. But I think sometimes we miss the real example of faith in the story. So I want to tell you, I'm going to tell you most of the story, and then we'll read some of it and we'll follow along. The Assyrians had invaded Israel and taken back captive to Babylon some of the Israelites. And they had taken Daniel and 3 of his friends, among many others, back to Babylon. And apparently they were pretty sharp young men because they saw real potential in them, and so they were grooming them to actually help be a part of the Assyrian government. And so the story begins in Babylon, like everything in Babylon began, with Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king. And Nebuchadnezzar had an image or a statue, better called an idol, made of himself or of his god. It kind of gets confusing. He kind of thinks he is a god, and so they're all kind of woven together. So he has this statue made. It's made of gold. It's a rather large idol. He put it in the middle of the city, and he spread the word that whenever the band comes out and plays, you're supposed to get up from wherever you are and come out to the idol and bow down and worship it. And just to sweeten the incentive, he said anyone who doesn't come out and worship this idol will be thrown into a furnace and burned to death. And so, you can imagine, the band came out and played. People came out of wherever they were. They knelt down. They bowed down before this idol. And that's kind of the way it went, except not everybody did that. And so some of Nebuchadnezzar's advisors came and told him that there were these 3 young Jewish men who refused to come out and bow down. And it made him very angry. It's similar to the book of Esther when Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman. So the names of these 3 young men were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But in the story, they're known by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was furious. He sent for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He told them he had heard this nasty rumor that they weren't coming out and bowing down to his idol, and that he hoped they would change their mind, that from now on they need to get with the program, and when they heard the music, they need to come out and get on their knees and worship. Well, they had to choose. Would they follow this tyrant and his wishes, or would they follow God? Now, here's the fascinating thing about the story. It's working on 2 levels. Because by the time the book of Daniel was written, the people who were first reading it were living under another tyrant named Antiochus Epiphanes. And guess what? He made a gold image of himself and wanted them to come worship that. Exactly like what's going on with Daniel. And so they're reading this story about how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were faced with the exact same choice they were faced with under a different tyrant. And so they're undergoing this exact same struggle. Do you cave in and do what you need to do to fit in, or do you put your faith in God and follow God? And as a matter of fact, every generation of God followers has to make this choice. Will we follow cultural idols or God? So the choice was before them. Let's read their answer. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I've set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, all kinds of music, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, we will not serve your gods or worship the images of gold that you have set up." And Nebuchadnezzar was furious when they told him that. So he ordered the furnace to be heated even hotter than it was. And then he had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego bound and thrown into the furnace. Let me continue the story down in verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw in the fire?" And they replied, "Certainly, your majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbounded and unharmed, and the 4th looks like the son of the gods." And Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed, and their robes were not scorched, and there was not even a smell of fire on them. So when Nebuchadnezzar looked down in the furnace, he saw 3 men, or 4 men, actually. And he said, "Didn't we put 3 men in there? And then now they seem to be unharmed, walking around." And so he called for them to come out, and they came out, and their hair wasn't even singed, and they didn't even smell like smoke, not even like they just walked out of a 7-Eleven store or something. And Nebuchadnezzar declared that the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was the true God. But just to prove that he really didn't understand what that meant, he said if anybody said anything bad about their God, they would be cut into pieces and their houses turned to rubble. Tyrants always think God needs them to protect God. And then he promoted these 3 young men. But it's always a little scary because when Nebuchadnezzar called for you, you never knew if you were going to be promoted or killed. It's a great story. It has a great ending. It's a great story of faith. But sometimes we take away the wrong message from this story. I've heard people quote verse 17. "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand." And I've heard people say that because they had faith in God, and because they proclaimed that faith in God, God delivered them. God rescued them and didn't allow them to be harmed because of their faith. So the message seems to be, if you have faith in God, God will always rescue you and everything will always work out the way you want it to. Now, don't misunderstand me. I believe in miracles. I know people that the doctor told to go home and get their affairs in order who outlived their doctor. I have seen relationships irreparably broken somehow egos swallowed, forgiveness granted, and relationships restored. I've seen people's lives changed in ways that are nothing short of miraculous. And I've seen people get opportunities to do things that would have never came their way without God's grace. So I believe in miracles. I believe that God is always able to deliver us from the furnace. And sometimes God does. But there were people reading this story, living under Antiochus Epiphanes, faced with the same thing. Bow down and worship his idol or die. And just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they chose to obey God. They chose to not bow down. And unlike Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they died. They were slaughtered. They were murdered. They obeyed God, and they weren't rescued. Elie Wiesel was a young boy when the Nazis came and took his family to Auschwitz. He watched as they led his mother and father and sister away to the furnace. They didn't get rescued. He watched the smoke go up. I've been to Auschwitz. I've stood in front of where those furnaces were. I've stood on that sacred ground. And one thing is for sure, standing up to a tyrant will either get you a front row seat to a miracle or you get to be a martyr. And the idea that if you have faith, you'll always be rescued and things will always work out seems to miss the real point of the story to me. Because I think the real expression of faith is not verse 17, it's verse 18. But even if God does not deliver us, we want you to know, Your Majesty, we will not serve your gods or worship your image of gold that you have set up. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, I know you think you are everything and a bag of chips. You think you're the supreme ruler of everything, but you're not. God is in control. And God will have the final say, not you. And God is able to deliver us from you, but if God does not, I will not bow to you, and I will not worship your idol. Now that is faith. That's real faith. See, if having faith means you always get rescued, then who wouldn't have faith? If loving God means God always makes everything turn out the way you want it to, who wouldn't love God? We'd be a fool not to. There's this ride, or used to be, I don't know, I haven't been there in years, at Disney World, called Mission Space. It's a pretty cool ride. It's a simulator. And you and three people get in it, and it's got this big screen, and you're on a launch pad, and then you take off, and the whole thing is just shaking like crazy as you take off into outer space. And then you get into space, and you have this mission that you're supposed to accomplish. And so you start, and of course, something goes awry, and then you have to take over the controls on your own, and you have to save the ship and rescue everybody and save the mission, which of course you always do. And then you fly it safely back home and land next to the gift shop. It's a pretty cool ride. You pretend to be an astronaut, and it's fun. And we can ride that ride, and then we can compare our experiences about what happened and how we took care of it, and about our astronaut experience. And you know, it almost seems real until you meet an actual astronaut. And then we say with pride, I read this ride at Epcot, and it was a simulator. I didn't even get sick. And she says, really, I flew the space shuttle. And we say, I was in that simulator for 4 minutes, and I never got sick or scared. And he says, well, I walked on the moon. In comparison, there's no comparison. You see, mission space is safe, and I know that. I will always complete the mission there. I will always win. And I will always get back home safely. Because Disney is the happiest place on earth, and if I'm dead, I can't spend my money. But real astronauts are not safe. They don't sit in a simulator. They sit on top of a rocket. And there's no guarantees they come back. As a matter of fact, in every space program we have had astronauts that didn't make it back. Being an astronaut is dangerous. I mean, there's risk. But there is incredible adventure. So I don't understand those who say that faith means God will always rescue you and always give you what you pray for. Sounds like a faith simulator to me. Mission faith, where you always get what you want, God always delivers you, and it's about as far from real faith as mission space is from being an astronaut. Real faith looks different. A person with real faith understands that God is able to rescue us from anything. But God doesn't always do what we want. And she believes that God can deliver her from any situation, but she's going to follow God, whether God does or not. She's going to love God and obey God, whether God answers her prayers the way she wants him to or not. I think of Job, who said, I will follow God if he kills me. I think of Jesus, who said, not my will, but your will be done. And then he went to a cross. Real faith doesn't follow God because everything always works out the way you want it to. Real faith doesn't love God because God always rescues us. Real faith obeys God because God is worthy to be obeyed. And real faith loves God because God is worthy to be loved. And some people think the highlight of the story is the end when the three young men emerge unscathed from the fire. Not me. The best part of the story is in the middle, when they look a tyrant in the eye and say, my God is able to deliver me from you. But even if he doesn't, I will never bow down, and I will never follow and worship your idol. That is faith. Some people read the story and say, do you have enough faith that God does whatever you ask? I think the question is, do you have the kind of faith that you love God and obey God even when you don't get what you ask? God is able to do whatever we ask. God is able to deliver us from whatever we find ourselves in, and sometimes God does. But real faith is when we can say, God, even if you don't, I will obey you, be faithful to you, and love you. That's faith.